This German Christian movement was something that had been sparked in 1917. It endorsed a German nationalism, hostility towards foreign peoples, and it legitimized anti-Semitism. So these churches, up until the 1930s, had been very loosely affiliated. You know, there were Lutheran churches, there were Reformed churches, there were some Catholic churches in Germany. But there was no tight association among any of them. They were all very loosely affiliated. But Hitler sought to centralize them and to bring them under the reign of the government. So he did that. And people like Bonhoeffer saw danger in that and sought to counteract that. And alongside that, Hitler also brought in some programs anti-Semitic programs, to say that German businesses were to be boycotted. And then he introduced this Aryan paragraph that said that anybody who had Jewish blood or non-Aryan blood in them were not permitted to have businesses. They were not permitted to be clergy. If the clergy person was married to someone who was non-Aryan, then that person would also be defrocked. So that paragraph was used to the detriment of many Jews, and people who weren't Jews, they just weren't identified as Aryan, as German enough. So as all this was happening in 1933, Bonhoeffer wrote an essay called "The Church and the Jewish Question." And he was actually the first to address the new problems that the church faced under the Nazi dictatorship. And Bonhoeffer argued that the real question was how the church would judge and respond to the Nazi state's actions against the Jews. So he was concerned about that. What are we going to say as a church, as a unified voice? What are we going to do with this government that is looking to oppress these people? And again, scholars think that he brought that forth because of his experiences in New York City with the oppressed African Americans that he had met there. So he was able to identify, similar things then that were going on in Germany. And he spoke out about it and became part of a movement called the Confessing Church Movement. And that was a movement that sought to bring the church out of the shadow of the Reich, out of the shadow of the government, and make it God's church, make it about the Bible, about being a communion of saints, all of that. And he wasn't alone in that. There were many pastors around who were interested in that as well. One very well-known theologian named Karl Barth was also worked alongside Bonhoeffer in that Confessing Church movement. And as a result of this Confessing Church movement, Karl Barth actually drafted something called the Theological Declaration of Barmen. And I'll list the essential tenets of that because I think it gives you an idea of what was happening in the church with regard to it being subjected to the government and being basically a puppet of the government. The Theological Declaration of Barmen had this to say about it. They had 6 essential tenets. First, the source of revelation is only the Word of God, Jesus Christ. Any other possible sources will not be accepted. Second, Jesus Christ is the only Lord of all aspects of personal life. There should be no other authority. Third, the message and order of the church should not be influenced by the current political convictions. Fourth, the church should not be ruled by a leader, a Führer. There is no hierarchy in the church. And 5, the state should not fulfill the task of the church and vice versa. State and church are both limited to their own business. And then 6th, therefore the Barmen Declaration rejects the subordination of the church to the state and the subordination of the Word and Spirit to the church. So again, trying to take the church out from under the shadow, under the umbrella of the government, and have it be its own standalone community and institution. So at the time in 1934, when Barth was drafting that, Bonhoeffer was actually in London, and he was taking that time. He was pastoring, of course, but he was also trying to establish ecumenical ties with people in England, and to tell them what was going on in Germany, and to tell them how serious it was, and to try to raise awareness in other areas, because he knew that if this was going to be a fight for the soul of the church, that wasn't something that he could do alone, it wasn't something that Germany could do alone, but they really needed partners in other countries as well. Bonhoeffer left London in 1935 and came back to Germany and actually opened a seminary in Finkenwald, along the lines of this confessing church movement, along the lines of trying to make sure that pastors continued to be instructed in, and that they lived according to, the essential tenets of religion, according to what the living Word, Jesus Christ, calls us to do. So while he was at this seminary in Finkenwald, he wrote a book called Discipleship. And I don't think I've said yet, but I have these books in my possession, and if you are interested at all in any of them, I am happy to loan them to you. So by all means, just let me know, and I'm happy to give these to you. But Discipleship is a book that is centered around the Sermon on the Mount, as recorded in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And there's some other material from Matthew that is also in here. But from Discipleship, or in other publications it was called The Cost of Discipleship, you get this idea that Bonhoeffer talked about and was very serious about, was this idea between costly grace and cheap grace. He says that cheap grace doesn't change the heart, and cheap grace is entirely human, whereas costly grace is entirely a gift of God. So he really wanted to talk about the cost of discipleship, and there's even some scriptures that talk about, that you need to know what it's going to cost you before you choose to follow Jesus. So he lifted up that idea of cheap grace versus costly grace in the book Discipleship. He also talked about obedience and what obedience really looks like in the context of faith. Who is my neighbor? What is suffering, and what is proper suffering for a Christian versus what Christ has done for us? Talks about pacifism. And actually, pacifism was something that he was very passionate about early on in his career, when he was more in the head space than the heart and experiential space. He thought that pacifism was only proper for a follower of Jesus and couldn't see any other way. And he talks about that in Discipleship as well. Talks about the nation, the church. So it talks about all kinds of different aspects of discipleship and what that means for us as disciples as we seek to follow Christ in all these different facets of our lives. So I do recommend that book to you. That one, Creation and Fall, both of those are pretty accessible, and the next one I will talk about is also accessible, and it's entitled Life Together. After a couple of years, maybe not even 2 years, the Gestapo came and shut down the seminary at Finkenwald. But Bonhoeffer wanted to share with people what they were doing at Finkenwald, and so that's what this book is about, Life Together. And it describes the shape of their life together at the seminary, and what the main themes of it is, their life together, that it's about community, it's about spending the day together, it's about spending the day alone, it's about service, to one another and service to the world, and confession and the Lord's Supper. So I think one of the primary takeaways from that book is not only does it give kind of a daily office and an order for the day, but also this sentence from there that has stayed with me all these years is, beware of the person who cannot live in community, and beware of the person who cannot live alone. So the person who is deathly afraid of community and the person who is deathly afraid of solitude, a mature disciple of Christ is able to inhabit both of those spaces and not be afraid. And this book, Life Together, really lays out spiritual disciplines for how to maintain that balance and how to maintain focus on Christ. The last part of that book is called the Prayer Book of the Bible. I'm trying to pull it out again. Prayer Book of the Bible. Again, you have to read it backwards. I'm sorry. Prayer Book of the Bible, and that refers to the Psalms. It was actually written in 1940, but the book that I have has the two things together, Life Together and the Prayer Book of the Bible, even though Life Together was written in 1937, shortly after the seminary had closed down. But the Prayer Book of the Bible begins with the words, Lord, teach us to pray. And it directs us, the reader, to the Psalms and says, Jesus prayed the Psalms. Jesus lived the Psalms. And he tells us how we may pray the Psalms and pray it with integrity. That we would recognize again within ourselves, the lament, the joyfulness, the seeking for God, the seeking for unity and longing for community, all the different things that are in the Psalms, the pain and the sorrow, all of it, that those things can become our prayer as they were Jesus's prayer over the course of his life. The interesting thing to note about the Prayer Book of the Bible is that nowhere in it does Bonhoeffer say, oh, and by the way, this is also the prayer book of the Jews, because the Jews are the ones who wrote down these Psalms, and Jesus himself was a Jew. So that might be an indication of the time at which he wrote it. It was 1940, and well past the time when people were being tolerant, most people were being at least openly tolerant of Jews and being on their side. So, that's one of those troubling aspects where you look at it and you say, well, if I were in that situation, I would have what? Stood up for a people when you know that it would cost you your life? Cost you your family's life, your well-being? I don't know. It's not an easy question. But at that time in 1940, we learned that Bonhoeffer was in fact very actively wrestling with that, and actually had come to the point of deciding that he needed to participate in the resistance. In fact, in 1939, he was invited back to Union Seminary, and he went and delivered a series of lectures. And while he was there, his friends encouraged him to stay and said, to go back to Germany is basically your death warrant. And Bonhoeffer decided he must go back to Germany. He must leave the safety of New York to go back to Germany. And he outlined his rationale for that in a letter to his friend Reinhold Niebuhr. He said, I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make this choice in security. So again, this idea of choosing this evil or this evil is where he found himself. And he decided that it was an act of discipleship. It was an act of being for his neighbor, for the other, to take on guilt himself. So he started to participate politically in the resistance. And he did so as an individual. You don't see anywhere that it was Pastor Bonhoeffer doing X, Y, or Z. He didn't write anything at this time. He didn't lecture at this time. He was really doing it outside of the church because he did not want to implicate the church in the choice that he had made. Because he had come to the point where he said anyone who was not ready to kill Hitler was guilty of mass murder, whether he liked it or not. Bonhoeffer even went as far as to declare himself ready to make an attempt on Hitler's life. However, before that, he would deliberately leave the church, which he did. And he worked for the Abwehr. He worked for the intelligence agency as a courier. And in his work as a courier, he delivered messages to people, of course, official Reich business, but then also people who were sympathetic to the resistance as well. And he sought to cultivate those relationships in secret. And in fact, he became involved with the group and several members of his family as well, to bring about the assassination of Hitler and their attempt, probably 3 attempts, hard to know for sure, but they failed. We know that Hitler ended up dying by suicide, so the assassination attempts failed. But it was shortly after one of those attempts that Bonhoeffer was arrested. So he was arrested in April of 1943 and taken to Tegel, which was an interrogation prison. And while he was in prison, he was able to communicate with his family and his friends by means of sharing books. So he would request certain books, and the soldiers would give them to him, the guards would give them to him, and they would write messages. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer would write messages to his fiancée at the time. He had become engaged in January of 1943, or to his parents, or to his good friend, and with a series of pencil marks they would make from the back of the book, so they would back of the book to the front of the book. So they would take like a very light pencil mark per page to get the message across of what it was that they wanted to communicate to their loved one. So these letters and papers were collected in another collection called Letters and Papers from Prison. This was assembled after his death. But this is also available, and some of this is kind of heady, but some of it is very personal as well. So this also is an interesting read. But in those letters, you really see his struggle. The days of him living strictly in his head were long gone, and now he was struggling with his emotions. He was struggling spiritually with his soul, struggling with God, as we all do. But I did want to include in this handout a poem that he wrote entitled, "Who Am I?" And I commend that to you because that shows the depth of the struggle that he was experiencing while in prison, and had so much time to reflect on who he was, who God is, how he came to be where he was in prison. And he wrote this to his friend Eberhard Bethke just before he was moved to another prison. He wrote this: "During the last year or so, I've come to know and understand more and more the profound this-worldliness of Christianity. The Christian is not a homo religiosus, so not somebody that is created for religion. But the Christian is simply a man, as Jesus was a man. I thought that I could acquire faith by trying to live a holy life or something like that. I discovered later, and I'm still discovering right up to this moment, that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. As I said, shortly thereafter, he was transferred to the Prince Albrechtstrasse prison, easy for me to say, in the basement of the Reich Security head office, which was not a good place to be. That was in October of 1944. And then he was transferred. He was supposed to be transferred, I think, to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, because by that time they did do a trial and they found that he was guilty along with his brother-in-law and some other family members. And so they were being transferred to a concentration camp. But he actually ended up at Flossenburg concentration camp, and there he was hanged on April 9th, 1945, by the German government. And a side note is that concentration camp was actually liberated by the Allies on April 23rd, so about 2 weeks later. And I leave you with these words of Bonhoeffer. Again, he said, "The goal of the Christian life isn't to become religious. Our relation to God is not a religious relationship to the highest, most powerful, and best being imaginable. Our relation to God is a new life in existence for others." He tried that route of being the perfectionist, of being the best disciple, and ended up pouring out his life for others, fully expecting that he would be brought before God and found guilty and condemned, and yet decided that that was the way to follow Jesus. Thank you for this time together. Again, if you have questions or you would like to have some of this reading material, please feel free to contact me. And peace be with you.